What if everything you've been told about losing belly fat is actually making you fatter? The harsh truth is that traditional weight loss methods are systematically destroying your metabolism and flooding your body with cortisol, the fat storage hormone that makes visceral fat nearly impossible to eliminate. This video reveals the scientifically proven approach that targets the most dangerous fat in your body without triggering the stress response that sabotages 97% of dieters. You're about to discover why eating less and exercising more is a metabolic disaster, and learn the counterintuitive strategy that allows you to lose weight fast while actually reducing inflammation, balancing hormones, and reclaiming the energy you thought was gone forever. By watching this video, you'll gain access to a complete framework for fat burning that works with your body's natural intelligence rather than against it. You'll understand exactly why visceral fat accumulates around your organs, how it silently contributes to diabetes, heart disease, and premature aging, and most importantly, the precise steps to eliminate abdominal fat without the misery, hunger, or cortisol spikes that make conventional dieting a living nightmare. This isn't another temporary fix. This is the blueprint for sustainable transformation that addresses the root cause of weight gain and gives you back control over your health, your body, and your future. The conversation around weight loss has become so distorted by misinformation and commercial interests that most people are unknowingly engaged in a battle against their own biology. When you understand the fundamental mechanisms that govern fat storage and fat burning, you realize that the standard advice, restrict calories, increase cardio by meal replacement shakes, is not just ineffective but actively counterproductive. The human body is an extraordinarily intelligent system that responds to environmental signals, and when those signals communicate scarcity, stress, and deprivation, the metabolic response is to hold on to every calorie and store it as protective insulation. This is precisely what happens when people embark on aggressive dieting protocols that slash food intake and ramp up exercise intensity without addressing the underlying hormonal chaos that drives visceral fat accumulation in the first place. Visceral fat is categorically different from the subcutaneous fat that sits just beneath your skin. While subcutaneous fat is relatively metabolically inert and primarily cosmetic, visceral fat wraps around your internal organs and functions as an active endocrine tissue that secretes inflammatory compounds and disrupts insulin sensitivity. This deep abdominal fat is directly linked to cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease, and systemic inflammation that accelerates aging at the cellular level. The reason so many people struggle to lose belly fat despite their best efforts is because they're attacking the symptom rather than the cause. Visceral fat doesn't accumulate because of laziness or lack of willpower. It accumulates because of chronic metabolic dysfunction, driven by insulin resistance, elevated cortisol levels, poor sleep, quality environmental toxins, and a nutrient-depleted food supply that leaves the body in a constant state of biological stress. Cortisol is the master stress hormone that orchestrates your body's response to perceived threats, whether those threats are physical danger, psychological pressure, or metabolic starvation. When cortisol levels remain chronically elevated, which is the reality for millions of people juggling demanding careers, inadequate sleep, relationship tension, and restrictive diets, the body prioritizes survival over everything else. Fat storage becomes non-negotiable because from an evolutionary perspective, stored energy is insurance against famine. The cruel irony is that the very strategies people employ to lose weight fast often trigger massive cortisol surges that make fat burning physiologically impossible. Excessive cardio sessions flood the system with stress hormones. Severe calorie restriction signals emergency mode. Insufficient protein intake compromises muscle tissue and tanks metabolic rate. The combination creates a perfect storm where the body cannibalizes lean tissue for energy while desperately clinging to visceral fat reserves. Breaking this cycle requires a fundamental shift in approach that prioritizes metabolic health over arbitrary numbers on a scale. The fastest way to eliminate abdominal fat is not through deprivation but through optimization. This means creating an internal environment where insulin sensitivity improves, inflammation decreases, cortisol normalizes, and the body feels safe enough to release stored energy. It means understanding that healthy meal plans are not about restriction, but about nourishment, providing your cells with the micronutrients, quality proteins, healthy fats, and fiber-rich carbohydrates they need to function optimally. It means recognizing that mental health resources play a critical role in weight loss because chronic stress, unresolved trauma, and emotional dysregulation all contribute to hormonal imbalances that manifest as stubborn body fat. The fitness industry has commodified your insecurity and sold you solutions that address surface-level aesthetics while ignoring the deeper metabolic dysfunction that determines whether you'll maintain your results or yo-yo back to your starting weight within months. Real transformation happens when you stop viewing your body as an adversary to be punished and start treating it as a sophisticated biological system that responds to signals. When those signals communicate safety, abundance, and proper nutrition, the body naturally muscle tissue increases because amino acids are available for protein synthesis. Energy levels surge because mitochondrial function improves. Sleep quality enhances because cortisol patterns normalize. And visceral fat melts away because insulin resistance reverses and the body no longer needs to Store excess glucose as triglycerides in adipose tissue. One of the most counterintuitive weight loss tips you'll encounter is that eating more specifically, eating more of the right foods at the right times can actually accelerate fat burning more effectively than severe restriction. This is because adequate nutrition supports thyroid function, maintains leptin sensitivity, preserves muscle mass, and prevents the metabolic adaptation that causes plateaus. When your body receives consistent signals that food is plentiful and stress is minimal, it has no biological reason to defend fat stores. The key is understanding macronutrient timing, food quality, and the difference between empty calories that spike blood sugar and nutrient-dense whole foods that provide sustained energy without triggering insulin surges. Slimming down and achieving a lean physique is not the result of suffering through miserable deprivation. It's the natural outcome of restoring metabolic flexibility and creating hormonal balance. Your body wants to be lean, energetic, and healthy. That is its default state when given the proper inputs. The challenge is that modern life systematically undermines those inputs through processed foods engineered for overconsumption, sedentary work environments, artificial lights that disrupt circadian rhythms, chronic low-grade stresses, and cultural messaging that equates worthiness with appearance. Navigating this landscape requires both education and strategy. You need to understand the science well enough to make informed decisions, and you need practical frameworks that fit into your actual life rather than idealized scenarios that exist only in fitness magazines. The promise of this approach is not just a smaller waistline but comprehensive health improvement that touches every system in your body. When you lose weight healthily by addressing root causes rather than suppressing symptoms, you simultaneously improve cardiovascular markers, enhance cognitive function, stabilize mood, increase libido, strengthen immune response, and reduce your risk of virtually every chronic disease. This is what happens when metabolic optimization becomes the goal rather than aesthetic manipulation. The mechanism by which visceral fat accumulates is far more complex than the simplistic calories in, calories out model that dominates mainstream weight loss discourse. When you consume carbohydrates, they are broken down into glucose, which enters the bloodstream and triggers insulin release from the pancreatic beta cells. Insulin's primary job is to shuttle glucose out of the blood and into cells where it can be used for immediate energy or stored as glycogen in muscle and liver tissue. However, these storage sites have limited capacity. Once glycogen stores are saturated, excess glucose gets converted into triglycerides through a process called de novo lipogenesis and deposited into adipose tissue. In metabolically healthy individuals with good insulin sensitivity, this system works beautifully. The problem emerges when chronic overconsumption of refined carbohydrates and sugar creates a state of perpetual insulin elevation that eventually leads to cellular resistance. Insulin resistance is the metabolic equivalent of crying wolf. When cells are constantly bombarded with insulin signals, they downregulate their receptor sensitivity as a protective mechanism. This means higher and higher levels of insulin are required to achieve the same glucose clearance, creating a vicious cycle where the pancreas works overtime, pumping out insulin while blood sugar remains elevated and fat storage accelerates. This is the metabolic quicksand that traps millions of people who genuinely believe they're doing everything right. They count calories meticulously, they spend hours on treadmills, they avoid dietary fat like it's poison, yet their waistlines continue expanding because the fundamental hormonal environment remains completely dysregulated. You cannot out-exercise or out-restrict a broken metabolism. The only sustainable path forward is metabolic repair. Boosting metabolism is not about thermogenic supplements or metabolism-boosting superfoods marketed with pseudoscientific claims. Real metabolic enhancement comes from restoring insulin sensitivity, optimizing thyroid function, preserving lean muscle mass, supporting mitochondrial health, and managing cortisol rhythms. Each of these factors influences your basal metabolic rate and your body's willingness to utilize stored fat for energy. Thyroid hormones essentially set the thermostat for how efficiently your cells burn fuel. When thyroid function is suppressed as a consequence of chronic dieting, micronutrient deficiencies, or autoimmune processes, metabolic rate plummets and fat burning becomes sluggish regardless of caloric intake. This is why some people can eat remarkably little and still struggle to lose weight fast, while others maintain leanness on substantially higher caloric intakes. The difference is metabolic efficiency. Muscle tissue is metabolically active and requires energy for maintenance, even at rest, which is why resistance training and adequate protein intake are non-negotiable components of any serious fat loss strategy. When you lose weight through caloric restriction alone without prioritizing protein and resistance exercise, you lose a significant proportion of lean tissue along with fat. This tanks your metabolic rate and virtually guarantees weight regain once normal eating patterns resume. The goal should never be weight loss in isolation but rather fat loss with muscle preservation or even muscle gain. This creates a body composition shift that not only looks better aesthetically but functions better metabolically. More muscle means higher insulin sensitivity, better glucose disposal, increased energy expenditure, improved functional strength, and enhanced longevity markers. The cortisol connection cannot be overstated when discussing visceral fat accumulation. Cortisol follows a diurnal rhythm that should peak in the early morning to facilitate wakefulness and gradually decline throughout the day, reaching its lowest point at night to allow for restorative sleep. Modern lifestyle systematically disrupts this pattern through late-night screen exposure, irregular sleep schedules, chronic psychological stress, excessive caffeine consumption, and intense evening exercise. When cortisol patterns become dysregulated with elevated nighttime levels or chronically high baseline levels, the consequences are severe. Cortisol directly promotes visceral fat deposition while simultaneously breaking down muscle tissue for gluconeogenesis. It interferes with leptin signaling, which governs appetite and satiety. It suppresses thyroid function and reproductive hormones. It impairs sleep architecture, which further compounds metabolic dysfunction. Breaking free from this requires intentional stress management practices, circadian rhythm optimization, and potentially adaptogenic support to modulate the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Mental health resources are not separate from physical health outcomes. They are intrinsically connected through bidirectional pathways between the brain and the body. Chronic anxiety, unresolved trauma, depression, and emotional dysregulation all manifest somatically through altered stress hormone patterns, inflammatory cytokine production, gut microbiome disruption, and ultimately metabolic disturbance. The person who uses food as a coping mechanism for emotional pain is not lacking willpower. They are experiencing a legitimate neurobiological response where certain foods temporarily modulate neurotransmitter activity and provide relief from psychological distress. Addressing this requires compassion, therapeutic intervention when appropriate, and recognition that sustainable weight loss often necessitates parallel work on psychological well-being. Meditation practices, cognitive behavioral strategies, trauma-informed therapy, and stress reduction techniques all contribute to the hormonal environment that determines whether fat burning is possible. The quality of your sleep might be the most underappreciated variable in the entire weight loss equation. During deep sleep, growth hormone is secreted, which facilitates fat oxidation and muscle repair. Sleep deprivation suppresses leptin and elevates ghrelin, creating a hormonal profile that increases hunger and cravings, particularly for high-carbohydrate foods. Inadequate sleep impairs glucose tolerance and insulin sensitivity even in young, healthy individuals after just a few nights of restriction. It elevates evening cortisol levels and disrupts the normal circadian rhythm of metabolic hormones. People who chronically sleep less than 7 hours per night have significantly higher rates of obesity and metabolic syndrome compared to adequate sleepers, even when controlling for diet and exercise variables. Prioritizing sleep is not laziness, it's metabolic optimization. Fitness should be redefined away from punishment-based cardio sessions towards sustainable movement practices that build strength, maintain joint health, improve cardiovascular capacity, and enhance overall function without triggering excessive cortisol release. This means incorporating resistance training to preserve muscle mass, strategic high-intensity intervals for metabolic conditioning, low-intensity movement like walking for stress reduction and fat oxidation, and mobility work to maintain movement quality. The chronic cardio approach, where people spend hours weekly on ellipticals and treadmills hoping to burn off dietary indulgences, is metabolically destructive and unsustainable. It elevates cortisol, increases appetite, breaks down muscle tissue, and creates compensation behaviors where people unconsciously reduce non-exercise activity throughout the day. Smarter training approaches recognize that more is not always better, and that recovery is when adaptation actually occurs. The nutritional landscape has become so contaminated with conflicting information that most people are paralyzed by confusion about what they should actually eat. Low-fat advocates insist that dietary fat makes you fat. Low-carb proponents claim that carbohydrates are toxic and insulin is the enemy. Plant-based enthusiasts argue that animal products cause disease. Carnivore adherents claim that plants are inflammatory. The truth is that dogmatic adherence to any single dietary ideology while ignoring individual metabolic context is a recipe for failure. What matters is understanding the principles that govern metabolic health and applying them in a way that aligns with your specific physiology, preferences, and lifestyle constraints. Some people thrive on higher carbohydrate intakes when those carbohydrates come from whole food sources and are timed around activity. Others do better with lower carbohydrate approaches that improve their insulin sensitivity and reduce inflammation. The framework matters more than the specific macronutrient distribution. Healthy meal plans are built on a foundation of nutrient density rather than caloric restriction. This means prioritizing foods that deliver maximum micronutrient value per calorie: vegetables, rich in vitamins and phytonutrients, quality protein sources that provide essential amino acids, healthy fats that support hormone production and cellular function, and fiber-rich carbohydrates that feed beneficial gut bacteria and stabilize blood sugar. When meals are constructed this way, satiety naturally improves because the body receives the nutritional signals it needs. Hunger is often not about caloric insufficiency but about micronutrient deficiency. Your body will continue generating hunger signals until it obtains the specific nutrients required for cellular function. This is why someone can consume thousands of calories of processed food and still feel ravenous, while someone eating nutrient-dense whole foods feels satisfied on substantially fewer calories. The quality of the food fundamentally changes the metabolic and hormonal response. Eliminating abdominal fat requires addressing insulin resistance as the primary target. This means implementing strategies that improve insulin sensitivity, time-restricted eating patterns that extend the fasting window and allow insulin levels to drop, resistance training that increases glucose uptake into muscle tissue independent of insulin, fiber intake that slows carbohydrate absorption and improves glycemic response, adequate protein consumption that supports muscle preservation and enhances satiety, strategic carbohydrate timing that aligns intake with periods of highest insulin sensitivity, and elimination of liquid calories and refined sugars that create massive insulin spikes without corresponding satiety. These interventions work synergistically to reverse the metabolic dysfunction that drives visceral fat storage. The concept of losing weight healthily stands in stark contrast to the aggressive fat loss protocols that promise dramatic transformations in unrealistic timeframes. Rapid weight loss achieved through severe restriction invariably results in muscle loss, metabolic adaptation, hormonal disruption, nutrient deficiencies, and psychological burnout. The body interprets extreme caloric deficits as famine conditions and responds by downregulating metabolic rate, increasing hunger hormones, reducing spontaneous activity, and prioritizing fat storage when food becomes available again. This is why crash diets produce temporary results, followed by rapid regain, often exceeding the original starting weight. Sustainable fat loss occurs at a moderate pace that allows for muscle preservation, metabolic adaptation prevention, and behavioral change integration. Aiming for 1 to 2 pounds of fat loss per week while maintaining strength and energy levels creates a trajectory that can be sustained for months without metabolic collapse. Weight loss tips that actually work are distinguished by their focus on behavioral sustainability and metabolic optimization rather than willpower-dependent restriction. Practical strategies include pre-planning meals to avoid impulsive food decisions, driven by hunger and convenience, creating an environment that supports success by removing trigger foods from immediate access, establishing consistent meal timing that regulates circadian metabolic rhythms, incorporating adequate protein at every meal to enhance satiety and preserve muscle mass, prioritizing sleep as a non-negotiable component of the recovery process, managing stress through practices that reduce cortisol burden, staying hydrated to support metabolic processes and differentiate thirst from hunger, tracking progress through measurements beyond just scale weight, including body composition, energy levels, sleep quality, and performance metrics, and building social support systems that reinforce positive behaviors rather than sabotage efforts. The interconnection between physical and mental well-being becomes undeniable when you examine the biological pathways that link psychological state to metabolic outcomes. Chronic stress activates inflammatory cascades through NF-κB signaling pathways that promote insulin resistance and fat storage. Anxiety disorders are associated with altered cortisol patterns and disrupted eating behaviors. Depression correlates with reduced physical activity, poor dietary choices, sleep disturbances, and metabolic syndrome. Addressing mental health is not tangential to fat loss, it is central to creating the internal environment where fat burning becomes possible. This might involve therapeutic interventions, medication when clinically appropriate, mindfulness practices, social connection, purpose cultivation, and lifestyle modifications that reduce chronic stresses. The person who resolves their relationship with food, manages their stress effectively, sleeps adequately, and maintains psychological well-being will lose belly fat more efficiently than someone who follows a perfect diet while remaining trapped in chronic stress and emotional turmoil. The promise of this comprehensive approach extends far beyond aesthetic improvements. When you eliminate visceral fat through metabolic optimization rather than metabolic destruction, you simultaneously reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, reverse insulin resistance, and prevent or reverse type 2 diabetes, reduce systemic inflammation that drives autoimmune conditions and accelerates aging, improve cognitive function and reduce dementia risk, enhance mood stability and reduce anxiety and depression, increase energy and vitality throughout the day, improve sexual function and hormone balance, strengthen immune system competence, and add healthy years to your lifespan. This is the difference between cosmetic weight loss and genuine health transformation. The fastest way to lose visceral fat is paradoxically the approach that doesn't rely on speed but on sustainability. It's the method that works with your biology rather than against it, that reduces cortisol rather than elevating it, that builds metabolic health rather than destroying it, and that creates lasting transformation rather than temporary results. This requires patience, education, and commitment to principles that may contradict everything you've been taught about slimming down and burning fat. But the reward is a body that functions optimally, a metabolism that works efficiently, and health that supports the life you want to live rather than constraining it. There's a natural solution to speed up your metabolism, control cravings, and support your weight loss journey naturally and effectively. Click the link in the first pinned comment to start transforming your body. If you want to truly transform your body and learn how to lose belly fat healthily, don't stop here. In the next video, I'll share practical strategies and little-known secrets to boost your metabolism and keep the weight off for good. Click now and discover how to take your weight loss to the next level.